Thank you for the invitation. We were just having a little chat before this got started, and I know there's a lot of different groups within Memorial that are doing ocean sciences, and we often, sit in different places, whether it's at the Ocean Sciences or up at the Marine Institute or down on the main campus. So I appreciate the opportunity to be able to connect with you guys in the biology department. So the talk that I'm going to give today is a bit of a summary of some work that I had been doing during my postdoc years, as well as some work that I'm continuing to do and some work that myself and my group at the Marine Institute are starting to develop. So this is a little bit of context. I mean, this is where I grew up in La Have, Nova Scotia, about an hour and a half south of Halifax near Lunenburg. If you've ever been, there's a great bakery. But the point of this photo is just to show that back in the 1940s, cod, as you know, was the history of Newfoundland as well, was the main sort of fishery in the region and the main catch. And a story that is not unique to Nova Scotia. We've seen a transition in recent years from finfish fisheries to invertebrate fisheries. And in Nova Scotia, lobster is by far and away the most important fishery from an ecological perspective, but also from a commercial and an economic perspective. So this is, what you commonly see around Nova Scotia these days, and you're hard pressed to find anyone who's catching cod. So this sort of framed, my upbringing, growing up in coastal Nova Scotia, seeing these changes. Also, we saw changes in some of the river systems and the anadromous species as well. So this is my father, my brother and I, we caught this Atlantic salmon in the La Have River back when you were able to do so. And, within my lifetime, this has changed as well. So, you're no longer able to catch and keep a salmon from La Have River, and the numbers have really plummeted. So this was kind of, the upbringing that informed the way that I approach marine ecology and fisheries science. So I did my undergrad at Dal and, studied the Newfoundland fishery, the collapse of the cod fishery in the Grand Banks. And I thought that maybe for my PhD, it would be useful to get a different perspective on fisheries management and marine conservation, given our history here, maybe studying some different ways of thinking about how we might approach it. So that brought me to New Zealand, and this is the south coast of Wellington. So this little patch of reef that you can see in the middle of the photo.
Sorry, I hate to interrupt, Tyler, but we're
No,
not getting any movement of your slides on our end.
okay.
Sorry, yeah,
Sorry.
we were just seeing that title slide.
Okay. Maybe I will try, just let me export this to a PowerPoint file.
Okay.
Because right now I have it as Keynote in Mac, but that might be the issue. So let me try that. How's the audio and the video otherwise?
Oh, it's great. Yeah, that's all good.
Okay, because sometimes my internet connection is a bit patchy. Okay, let's try this. Okay, can you see that? Is it advancing?
Yep, that's perfect.
Okay, so just hover on these photos so you know what I was talking about. Here's the photo of La Have, the cod fishery catches in the 40s, what you'd expect to see these days. Me and my brother and my dad and the Atlantic salmon that we caught. I think that thing almost dragged me down the river. And yeah, this brings us to New Zealand, to this patch of temperate reef, which actually is a marine protected area. So this was all protected, the year that I started my PhD, and the marine lab was right here. So this is the view I had while writing my PhD thesis. And I also spent a lot of time on this coast diving and surveying reef fish. So when New Zealand has a bit of a different system, they're one of the first countries in the world to declare a marine reserve or protected area. They also have the individual transferable quota system. So it was an interesting place to study, fisheries and marine conservation and marine ecology, and that sort of informs the work that I do. So a little bit about SEAFER. the Center for Fisheries Ecosystems Research, and trying to bridge these silos at MUN. We're based within the School of Fisheries at the Fisheries and Marine Institute, commonly referred to as MI. We grant MSc and PhDs in fisheries science. There's no bachelor program. A new department formed in 2010 with support from the provincial government. Last time I counted, we have a director, 8 research scientists, 3 postdocs, 21 grad students, and 5 technical staff. We also have access to a number of boats as well. So our mandate is to focus on Newfoundland and Labrador fisheries and the sustainability of stocks. We offer research and training opportunities to grad students. We collaborate with DFO a lot for research activities and fisheries management. And we also have widespread collaborations beyond Memorial and beyond Canada. So the main areas of research within CFAR, there's a group of scientists who do stock assessment led by Noel Cadigan along with Fan Zhang and Jin Gao. There's some individuals who study fisheries ecology and habitat, Sherry Lynn Rowe, Arnaud Labrie, and Jonathan Fisher. Maxine Geoffroy does a lot of work in the Arctic and uses a lot of acoustics to sample fish populations. And my background is in ecosystem modeling and climate change. So a brief overline of today's talk. I'm going to introduce the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC, which you may have heard about. Some climate change impacts on the oceans and fisheries that I've been involved in with a wider group. Building confidence in climate change projections, and then shifting focus a little bit to changing Newfoundland and Labrador ecosystems to the regional scale, as well as some work that my group is doing to apply global climate change and ecosystem tools to Newfoundland and Labrador. So the oceans provide over half of the oxygen on the planet. They absorb 93% of the excess heat trapped by greenhouse gas emissions, and they absorb 25 to 30% of the CO2 that we emit. So when we think about the Earth system and we think about climate change, it's really important to consider what's happening in the oceans. So the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is the United Nations body for assessing science related to climate change. It's created to provide policymakers with regular scientific assessments on climate change, its implications, and potential future risks, as well as to put forward adaptation and mitigation options. So it's really high-level reports that policy leaders from around the world can use to inform their decision-making. It's the largest scientific collaboration in history with more than 800 authors, hundreds more review, edit, and draft the reports. And the last assessment was based on 9,200 peer-reviewed studies. The text from these reports has to be agreed upon by all 195 IPCC member nations. And the IPCC reports are the most comprehensive climate change science resources. So the first assessment report was published in 1990. The latest assessment was the 5th, and that was published in 2014. And the next assessment, the 6th, is due to be published in June 2022, although some of those dates have been changing for the 6th assessment given present circumstances. The ICC sometimes also publishes interim special reports, such as the 1.5 degree warming report published in 2018, or the most recent report on the oceans published in 2019. So this is what the approval of that last special report on the ocean and the cryosphere looked like. All of these 195 member nations trying to agree on the text, because in some cases, it's binding for governments based on what is said in the report, what the actions of our government might be. So this actually took 27 hours to get this approved. And here's the celebration of everyone who's probably happy to get out of that conference room that I suspect probably doesn't have any windows. And the report itself is 1,170 pages. So if you've ever looked through any of these, you know that they're very comprehensive. So the whole underpinning of the Earth system and a lot of the projections that the IPCC makes are based on Earth system models, often referred to as ESMs, related to general circulation models or general climate models, GCMs. They're all kind of different flavors of the same variety. And basically how they work is that they divide the globe up into these individual grid cells here. Oftentimes they'll use a 1 degree by 1 degree latitudinal grid, sometimes 0.5 or in some cases a 1/4 degree grid cell. Um, and then there's also vertical layers as well. So if you want to represent different areas of how wind is moving or precipitation, there's the vertical resolution, as well as in the ocean, there's depth resolution as well. And these are some of the different physical processes that are represented in Earth system models, with the external forcing variable being the radiation for the sun. And that's what the different emission scenarios are based on. So there's a lot of different Earth system models that have been developed by various groups around the world. And different research groups represent these different processes in different ways. And as a result, there's variation in climate change projections. And so the IPCC recognize this variation, and they use this framework to evaluate the evidence. So basically, among these different model groups, they'll look for the amount of agreement in the projections, and they'll look at the amount of evidence as well. So in the best case scenario, you have high agreement and robust evidence, and in the opposite scenario, you have low agreement and limited abundance or limited evidence, which would give you lower confidence in those projections. So as a result of having to compare all these different model projections, there's been a number of MIPS that have been established, and MIPS are model intercomparison projects. So the MIP that is used to make all the physical projections is referred to as the coupled MIP or CMIP. So that's what the IPCC reports rely heavily on. There's also this group called the EASY MIP project, which is intersectoral impact MIP. This MIP here, Fish MIP, Fisheries and Marine Ecosystem MIP, which is I'll be speaking a bit more about throughout the talk. And basically, these groups have come together recognizing that there's all these different models that are out there, and the IPCC has a call to come up with a way to be able to compare them in a meaningful way. So it's really a standardization process of trying to run simulations in a standardized fashion such that you can make meaningful comparisons among all these different models. So if we switch to climate change impacts on the oceans and fisheries in that context, here are some projections you may have seen. This is from the CMIP 5 ensemble. So CMIP numbers their iterations of modeling based on the IPC assessments. So this CMIP 5, that was performed for the 5th assessment. So now you can actually access CMIP 6 model runs, which were produced for the 6th assessment. And we can look at projections of different variables. So we have here in the top left panel, global sea surface warming under different carbon emission scenarios. So the RCP 8.5 is a high emission scenario. The RCP 2.6 is a strong mitigation or low emission scenario. And we can see the projections under each one of those scenarios to the end of the century. And one thing you might notice is there's a lot of variability in these projections, and that's based on what each of these individual models might be predicting. Under the extremes, we can see projections of about 3 to 4 degrees increase under the high emission scenario. And under the low emission scenario, we're still projecting an average of almost about a degree of sea surface warming. If we look at other variables such as pH, we can see that among the models, there's actually very good agreement in how pH is projected to change with under different emission scenarios. So not all variables, show this degree of variability. We can also look at oxygen content shown in the bottom left panel here, as well as global net primary productivity in this bottom right panel. And this is something that in the marine ecosystem modeling community is an important driver, along with temperature, in making projections of how biomasses of food webs might change. And we can see here that there's quite a lot of variability, and these bars actually show the full range of variability for each one of these emission scenarios. And you can see for the high emission scenario, we're projecting anywhere from a minus 18% decrease in primary productivity to perhaps even a slight increase in primary productivity. So huge amount of variability to think about when trying to make climate change projections. And if we look, this is just that same plot again, but now we have some maps showing where these increases and decreases are projected to happen. And what you notice from these maps is that it's not the case that there's a uniform decrease in primary productivity over the world's oceans. There are some areas where actually projected to have increases. So here again is the low emission scenario. The high latitudes typically are where there are projected to be increases in primary productivity, and then the low latitudes typically are where you see the strongest declines. And then if we look at the high emission scenario, we see that the magnitude of these trends intensifies, where again we're really seeing a lot of the low latitude oceans projected to have strong declines in net primary productivity, and the higher latitudes perhaps uh, having increases. So we can use this information within fisheries and ecosystem models because we know how individual species respond to temperature changes and primary productivity changes. There's been ecosystem models that have tried to integrate all of these different food web interactions or species interactions. And so the idea behind FishMIP, or the Fisheries and Marine Ecosystem MIP, was to come up with a way to use these climate change projections as input variables within marine ecosystem models in order to run a standardized set of climate change scenarios that we can uh, compare meaningfully afterwards. And this project has been going on for, I think, about 6 or 7 years now. And as part of my postdoc working with Heike Lotze at Dalhousie, we set out to come up with a protocol that all these different ecosystem models could run. And we're probably a bit naive at first, and that may have been why we got into it. But we quickly realized that this was no small feat. So there's a lot of different diversity of different types of models that are out there. There's size or age-based models. There's food web models, such as your classic ecopath model. There's species distribution models. There's also hybrid models, and all of these models work in different ways. They all have different data requirements, and they all produce different outputs. So the challenge for FishMIP, our first challenge, was to develop a common protocol that all models can follow to make climate change projections. And we've documented this protocol in a paper that was led by Derek Tiddenser. So the first few years of FishMIP was really, getting all these modelers get together, sitting around different workshops or meeting at conferences when we could have little side events, and trying to get everyone together and figure out how we were going to deal with this complexity of models that we were working with. So now FishMIP has grown to a network of more than 50 climate and marine ecosystem modelers. We've also started to develop some future fishing scenarios. So we've had to bring in social scientists, economists, lawyers, historians, as well as integrated assessment modelers. So our group has really grown, and it's been exciting to be a part of it. So the basic approach for the FishMIP simulations is we use environmental inputs from the CMIP project. So typically, primary productivity and temperature are what most models use. Some models also can use pH or oxygen or water velocities or water movements. So that's kind of the physical driver. The oceans are also affected by fishing and by humans, and where we might decide to protect different areas. So we've really drawn on work by the IPCC to develop different socioeconomic scenarios referred to as SSPs, which you might be familiar with. Basically, there's a sustainability pathway, which is often paired with a low emission scenario. There's other pathways that are more focused on individual nations and less about sustainability, and those are typically paired with high emission scenarios. So we use these as inputs, and we run the simulations with this ensemble of ecosystem models. And then we're able to compare the outputs, among the ecosystem models within FishMIP, but also we've standardized our protocols so that we can fit in with other sectors such as agriculture. So we can ask questions, is the ocean going to be able to provide food for people in areas where agricultural production is expected to decline under climate change? So we managed, after I think about 6 years, to get our first results paper out, which was again led by Heike Lotze and was published in 2019. And this is an ensemble of projections. So this is the model mean of I think 6 different global marine ecosystem models that participated in the first round of FishMIP under a low emission scenario here on the left and a high emission scenario here on the right. So this is the relative change in total biomass at the end of the century. And this is without fishing. So this is basically just looking at the climate signal and how that's projected uh, to impact biomass in the oceans. So again, following on from the projections of changes in primary productivity, we can see a lot of declines in the lower latitudes, potentially increases in biomass at high latitudes. And as we move to higher emission scenarios, we see that these trends intensify. We can also look at this ensemble of ecosystem models to see where the models have good agreement, which is shown in the darker, or maybe areas where there's less agreement among the models about how much the biomass is expected to change. And this can inform our future modeling efforts to try to understand why there isn't good agreement in specific regions and to use that to improve our models moving forward. So some of the headline findings from this first study. Similarly to the projections of primary productivity, we observe large amount of variability in protected biomass among climate scenarios. So here's the change in animal biomass in the oceans. The red again is the high emission scenario. So we're projecting as much as a 17% decline on average among this ensemble for the high emission scenario. We also looked at how much variability was due to which climate forcing we chose to use. So we didn't rely on a single Earth system model. We used an ensemble of Earth system models, as well as our ensemble of ecosystem models to see if it really matters how much your projections vary based on which climate model you use versus which ecosystem model you use. And what we found is in the low emission scenarios shown here in blue, we have about similar amounts of variability due to which ecosystem model you choose compared to which Earth system model you choose. We found similar results for the high emission scenario, except we see here that there's even more variability. So basically more uncertainty in projections as we increase the emissions. But on average, there's about similar amounts of variability due to which ecosystem model you chose and which Earth system model you chose. We also found that there was about a 5% loss of ocean biomass with every 1 degree Celsius of global warming, and that the biggest losses were at the top of the food web, or the predators. So our goal of FishMIP was really to be able to provide information to the IPCC process, and we were happy that our results from FishMIP were part of the summary for policymakers in this last special report. So this is a summary of FishMIP projections. There's also a lot of other great information in the report that's summarized in infographics that are easy to communicate if you ever have to do presentations or give talks to the general public. So there's information about coral reefs, polar seas, fisheries, what the general trends are, what the other human impacts might be, and some of the resulting consequences. So it's really a comprehensive and good resource. So if you're interested to read more about the details of our protocol and how we go about comparing and running these simulations, again, here's that protocol paper. All of the data that is produced by FishMIP simulations is publicly available and it's open access. So here's a citation for the regional sector within FishMIP. So you're able to go online and you can actually explore all of this data. Within the EasyMIP project, so this is the wider project that I mentioned before, we also developed a protocol to evaluate the impacts of 1.5 degree global warming and how you would do that with ecosystem models. So that again, this is really trying to talk to specific policy agreements such as the Paris Agreement. And also we've contributed to the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, or IPBES. So looking at some of their climate change projections as well. So that was kind of the the main findings from the first round of FishMIP, and we're continuing on within the group to try to develop some of these future fishing scenarios following the SSPs, as well as trying to understand some of the mechanisms and some of the reasons why we see the large variation among the marine ecosystem models. So FishMIP continues, and we've just finished our second round of simulations, and we're writing up and submitting the papers right now, hoping that we'll be able to contribute to the sixth assessment, IPCC sixth assessment of climate change. So I mentioned EasyMIP before. So FishMIP falls within this wider group of modeling efforts. So we have fisheries and oceans, but there's also a lot of other groups such as agriculture, biomes, coastal infrastructure, agriculture, water, forests, health, energy, and permafrost that have all run simulations in a similar fashion, pulling in environmental forcing from the climate models and pulling in socioeconomic forcings from the SSPs. And again, we tried to standardize among all these different sectors so that we can compare the oceans to all these other different groups under different emission scenarios. And one way in which we've done so is we've compared, as I alluded to before, the future of food production from the oceans compared to the future of food production on land. And this was a paper that was led by Julia Blanchard, published in 2017. And basically, we used some of the agricultural models and compared them to the marine ecosystem models to look at where we're expected to see changes in food production on land versus sea. And we can see the greatest changes here in the red colors and the smaller changes in the bluer colors. And to summarize, we broke down the projected changes by nation according to their development index. So here we have high developed countries. In the bottom left, we have lower developed countries. And our axis here are changes in terrestrial production. So if you're below the horizontal line, you're expected to have a decline in terrestrial production by the end or by the middle of the century. And we have a reverse axis here. If you're on the right-hand side of the vertical line, you're expected to have a decline in marine production. And unfortunately, one of the results of this study was all of the lowest developed countries are projected to have both declines in agricultural production as well as terrestrial production. So this really speaks to the importance of climate change and human development and in general. So as I mentioned, one of our activities now within FishMIP is trying to develop these future fishing scenarios. In the first round, really because we were kind of just getting our feet wet, we were able to incorporate all the environmental variables, but we treated this aspect of the simulations relatively simply. We either ran a no fishing scenario, which basically was to tease out the climate effect, and we ran a fishing scenario where we held all fishing constant at 2005 levels and just ran it forward. But we're working now to develop different scenarios of protected areas and fishing effort along these different sustainability pathways. And again, we're following this SSP framework, which typically gets matched up with the different emission scenarios. We're also considering the IPBES, the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. They're developing some scenarios as well, and we're trying to align our scenarios within FishMIP so that we can also contribute to this effort. So IPBES is using a bit of a different scenario framework, but they use three kind of different scenarios where you have a nature for nature. Basically, you think about protected areas and maximizing conservation. They have a nature as culture scenario, culturally important fish species or land species for a community. And they also have nature for society. And you can think of these as your ecosystem services, fisheries production, water filtration, and these types of things. So these are kind of the three axes that the IPBES scenarios group has been working on. And we've been trying to develop our fish MIP scenarios so that we can contribute to both. Okay, so a little bit about how we are working to build confidence in climate change projections. So I've shown you lots of ways in that these different models vary. And some of the work we've been doing more recently is trying to understand why they vary like they do and how we might be able to build some confidence in our projections. So I often use the analogy of using a weather forecast, and that's especially dynamic here in this part of the world. Um, so you can look at a weather forecast from Environment Canada on the top or from the Weather Network on the bottom. You could have looked at the weather forecast from a week ago, and then today we could do a retrospective where we look to see, okay, which of these different forecasts was the most close to the actual observations, and we can use that as a way to improve our models. And we can compare models in this way. So this is something that we do within the marine ecosystem modeling world as well. And one exercise that we've done is we've looked at the impact of extreme events, and we've used the 2003 European heat wave as a case study. So this was, there was more than 70,000 human deaths associated with this heat wave. It was the hottest recorded summer in Europe since 1540. It had impacts on crop yields, infrastructure, ecosystem services, spreading of diseases. And here's a map of the North Sea looking at the sea surface temperature anomaly, which was, 1.5 times or 1.5 degrees warmer than it was on average. We could also look at what that did and what that meant for the change in net primary productivity. And then we can also look to observe catches in that region and then compare that to what our models would have projected given that they were driven with Earth system model environmental data. So not only did we do that in the oceans, we compared our marine projections to those to agriculture, freshwater, terrestrial ecosystems, forestry, electric energy generation, and human health. So basically, this is a calibration exercise to see if our models projected the same impacts that were actually observed, or if maybe they over projected or under projected. So this is the year of the heat wave here. And these are the model projections of what the total catches were within that year. So we can see that there is a fair bit of annual variability, maybe a bit of cycling here in the catches in the North Sea. So this was a lower year of catches on average, but it's not outside of the normal range of variability for what you might see in this region. So we compared our model projections to the Sea Around Us catch database, and we found that the trends lined up pretty good. So in this case, the model projections given these environmental forcing variables actually matched up with the observations quite well. However, for a lot of the other different sectors, it was observed that the majority of models underestimated the extremeness of the impacts in important sectors such as agriculture, terrestrial ecosystems, and heat-related human mortality. And impacts on water resources and hydropower were overestimated in some river basins. And I think there's a formatting error there because the last bullet point is cut off. But yeah, this is one exercise that we use in order to try to, understand how our models are doing compared to real observations. So we do these retrospectives quite a bit. So I'm just going to use the last 5 or 10 minutes of the talk to bring it into Newfoundland and Labrador and a little bit of the work that my group has started to try to understand what's happening in this region. So if you're ever interested to see observations for this part of the world or for Canada more broadly, there was a great report published by DFO in 2018 called Canada's Oceans Now, and there's an Atlantic Ecosystems report. And this really summarizes the observations that we've seen in recent years and how that relates to climate change. So here's the region that the report summarizes. So we see the Newfoundland Labrador shelf all the way down to the Scotian shelf as well as the Gulf. And we can see on average an increase in sea surface temperature, a decrease in chlorophyll A, which is often used as a proxy for primary productivity, And you can see that, there is regions within the Gulf, for example, that we are seeing increases in primary productivity. So this again is showing the spatial variability, but on average for the region, there have been declines. We've seen shifts in the zooplankton community, so declines in calanus, which we know is important for marine mammals, as well as an increase in non-copepod abundance. So this really has implications for shifts, through higher trophic levels in food webs. We know that the fish community has changed with the collapse of the northern cod stock, and it's still remained at low levels. We've seen catches of commercial invertebrates, increase quite dramatically. However, those have been declining in recent years as well. So there's been a lot of changes that have happened in the region in the last 20 or 30 years. We can also think about timing of spring blooms, and as the waters warm, whether or not the bloom of the plankton communities matches with when important forage fish species such as capelin are around, and what that means for transfer of energy to higher trophic levels within food webs. So these are all changes that are going on in our region, and the question and the challenge that my group is really trying to address is what can we expect for the future under these different climate change scenarios. So the last section that I'll talk about is applying global climate change and ecosystem tools to Newfoundland and Labrador. So this is really using a lot of these different methods and approaches that were developed within the FishMet project, and trying to bring them to the Newfoundland and Labrador scale. So if we look back again to this figure from the Lotz et al. Paper that summarized global changes, we see here that for the Newfoundland and Labrador region, there's projected declines in ocean biomass, but we can see not much farther north, there's actually projected to be increases. So this is really on the edge of this barrier where there could be either increases or decreases. So there's this is a transition zone under these different emission scenarios. And as I mentioned, some of the work has been tried that we've been trying to do is how do we disentangle some of the diverse responses that we see among marine ecosystem models. So basically, we've run some experiments where we've only manipulated the change in temperature in the ecosystem model, and each one of these rows represents a different global marine ecosystem model. Or we've done experiments where we've only changed the low trophic levels or the plankton communities, and look to see what impacts that has on the food web. And then the simulations where we do all the climate change, so we allow all the variables to be inputs. And some of our key findings that there's little consensus about the spatial redistribution of biomass or changes in the balance between small and large organisms in response to warming. Low trophic level impacts on total consumer biomass varied significantly with the choice of which low trophic level terms you use within your models. So some groups only use plankton communities, some only use primary productivity, some use zooplankton, some differentiate between small zooplankton groups and large zooplankton groups. So how you incorporate those low trophic level variables in your ecosystem model is going to have a lot of impact on what you project for changes in the future. And overall climate change impacts on consumer biomass and ecosystem structure are well approximated by the sum of temperature and low trophic level impacts, indicating an absence of nonlinear interactions between the model's drivers. So that's some recent work, of trying to understand how these different variables interact with each other when we look at this ensemble of models under climate change scenarios. So work that I've been leading is trying to compare these global marine ecosystem models, which are often represented on a 1 degree grid cell scale, which is approximately 100 kilometers by 100 kilometers, is sort of the grain size of resolution, to some of the more regionally developed ecosystem models that are often at very fine spatial scales. And one of the key findings that we've been noticing is that among these global ecosystem models, oftentimes there's a lot of variability in the projections, but they all project the same direction of change. So they often project, a global decline in biomass. But when we zero in on specific regions around the world, and this is a model that I developed for the part of New Zealand where I studied my PhD, we see that the regional model might project increases in biomass, whereas the ensemble of global models projects the opposite direction. So this has really led us to try to understand, why now are we not even see projections that are even going the same direction. So this is something that's been identified within the ecosystem modeling community, and we've been working on trying to understand further. So one way to get around this is to use finer scale oceanographic models or climate models. And there's a group of models that are referred to as ROMs, or regional ocean modeling systems, and they can provide environmental variable projections at a lot finer resolution. And here's just an example of what you might get from a ROMS model. For the Grand Banks, for example, there's almost 4,000 grid cells for this region. And if we look at some of these global Earth system models, in the best case scenario, we might have about 200 grid cells, and in the worst case scenario, only 13 grid cells. So we start to think about representing fine scale coastal processes such as upwelling or eddies or movement of water. And something that's very coarsely resolved is probably not going to capture those dynamics in the same way that something is more highly resolved. So that's one thing that we've been looking at. And there's been some work based out of Dalhousie, a recent paper that's in revision, looking at observations of these different variables of temperature, chlorophyll, and nitrates compared to these different model ensembles and how they compare. And one thing that they've observed is, in a lot of cases, the ROMS models, which are in green, are more close to the observations of a spring bloom, for example, whereas the global Earth system models oftentimes underestimate the chlorophyll A, which is a proxy for primary productivity, by about half. So you're missing, in some cases, half of the primary productivity in these global Earth system models compared to what's observed. So this is something we're thinking about moving forward, how we might incorporate these regional oceanographic models to make our climate change projections for the Newfoundland region, rather than pulling these global Earth system model projections in. So a little bit about what we're working on right now. So we're working on some ecosystem model development for the Newfoundland shelf, so the 2J3K, and another model for the Grand Banks, the 3LNO region, using both size-based or MISR models. There's a package within R that you can use, developed by Simon Jennings and Julia Blanchard, as well as models of intermediate complexity, or MICE models. Some other projects are looking at how is environmental and ecosystem information incorporated into single species stock assessments. So this is collaboration with some of the folks at DFO, following the recent changes to the Fisheries Act, which now suggests that you can consider these types of information when we're looking at these single species stocks that we know are not acting alone. And is management prepared for changing oceans? And this has been a collaboration with the Ocean Frontier Institute. And we just held a workshop a couple of weeks ago where we asked the question about should reference points for different fisheries change as the productivity of the ecosystem changes and as climate change affects species distributions. So I have a couple PhD students who are working on the model development. Unfortunately, they've both arrived during the pandemic, so you probably haven't seen them around, but Abe Solberg is going to be working on the 2J3K region, and Raquel Ruiz is going to be working on the Grand Banks region. And I think I'll wrap it up there. Hopefully I've left enough time for questions. And I'd be happy to chat further if anyone has any questions or comments. So thank you for your attention.
Cool. Thanks, Tyler. That was a great talk. If anyone has questions, if they just want to type in the chat box, and then we can go in order of what appears on there. Cool. Sean, go for it.
Hi, Tyler. Thanks a lot for the talk. Really enjoyed it. Great to see some of this sort of multi-scale modeling going on. Not easy, and nice to see some local folks doing that. So yeah, great stuff. I'm curious, and you kind of alluded to, and I don't know the links exactly. So my question is, like, our group and a few other groups in terrestrial systems were looking at the effects of animals on carbon cycling. And I know William Xiong and various other groups, part of your co-author groups, are doing that in the oceans in terms of, blue carbon and so on, with large stocks of pelagic fish, whales. It seemed like most of this work was looking at the feedbacks of climate on biomass. Is there any loop back to biomass influencing climate, or is that something you're building in?
Yeah, so most of the models use a one-way coupling. So basically they get the inputs from the climate models and it doesn't really feed back in real time. The only model that I know of that does the two-way coupling is Atlantis, which is the model developed by Beth Fulton out of Cyro in Australia. And she has a whole biogeochemical model that runs in real time with the ecological model as well as the social ecological model. So she's got three sort of models that speak to each other in each time step and all sort of feedback on each other. But I know that's a highly demanding process from a computational perspective, and that's only ever been implemented on regional scales. I don't know if Beth has any plans to ever try to scale that up on a global level. But to my knowledge, that's the only marine ecosystem model that does, complete that full loop. And a lot of it to date has been, I think, the processing power that's required to run these simulations. I know my postdoc at UBC was with William, and I used to have to do his species distribution model runs for the global scale. And I think it would take me about 6 days to do one simulation to get the supercomputer to spin through all of that. So that's still very much, I think, a limitation at the global scale anyway.
I guess a follow-up, do you think there is any feedback possible? I mean, there's a huge amount of biomass in animals generally in the ocean, or is it something we should look at, or is it just probably not important given other drivers in the ocean?
I think it probably is. I haven't looked at the numbers to see, what the scale of the contribution might be and how that, factors into the grand scheme of things and how much variability that might explain or what contribution that might make. I mean, you probably have a better idea. I know I have heard people speak out about it at various conferences and workshops though, but it's one of those things that people would like to do. But I think we're still, with the exception of Beth Fulton, still a little ways off there.
Great, thanks. Yeah.
Yeah.
Good. I had a question in terms of you're talking about this like issue of resolution in terms of like the grid cells that you can actually pull data from. Is there a bottleneck in that in terms of like the computing power a certain individual has at their like universities? That are only some people able to like get down to that resolution to actually like pull data models?
Yeah, that's a trade-off as well for the Earth system modeling community. I think at the 1 degree grid, there's like 350,000 grid cells on the planet surface of the planet. And so you can imagine as you go down to the half degree and the quarter degree, the computing power required increases exponentially. And yeah, I have seen some runs with one of the models where they show a quarter degree grid, but the requirements to contribute to the IPCC is you have to have a core set of simulations under all these different emission scenarios. So usually they're not able to produce, everything that's required, but there are still some runs where they've just experimented with running at the higher resolution. And you really do see, as you move to higher resolution, some of these important coastal processes such as upwelling or coastal eddies starting to show up, whereas at the 1 degree grid cell scale, those don't really show up, and you're getting about half as much primary productivity as is observed. So that's been a challenge for us as regional modelers too, is, we're trying to use these global projections, but there's only half as much primary productivity as, what our system is observed to have and what the model has been calibrated to include. So that's been a challenge that we've had to deal with, as well as trying to match these global models that don't always, calibrate well with what we observe on regional scales. So I think, yeah, the future of trying to improve those projections, I think part of the solution is higher resolution and including these coastal processes. And I have heard stories of, people trying to fight over access to the supercomputer because they have, model runs that are due to submit to the IPCC, and, there's a, I don't know, a pecking order or a hierarchy or a system set up by who gets access to. And so they have to try to sweet talk their way into access to the supercomputer so they can punch through all these simulations to meet their deadlines. And
Is there one of those supercomputers in Newfoundland at MUN, like anywhere here? Like, is this someone that
they're
does?
often referred to as like a cluster. I suspect there is. I haven't had to access it yet. There's a lot of cloud computing that you can do these days too, where you just like pay for access to, cloud computing, and you can set up your local simulation files on your computer, and then you send them all to as a server, and then, it grinds through all of the simulations and then sends you a summary of the output that you're interested in. So I suspect that is the case, but I haven't accessed it here at MUN or in Newfoundland yet.
Cool.
Oh, Sean just sent a link in the chat, so I think, yeah, there is.
Great. Any other questions from the audience?
Ask in response to Sean, I don't think there is enough biomass in animals to have any impact, any significant impact. There may be impact indirectly through affecting what happens to the bloom and what happens to the organic matter, whether it stays recycled in the surface waters or it's sent into the deep ocean. So I don't think there is a direct impact of, let's say, level on fishery, unless it affects in turn what happens to the lower trophic level and to the respiration by bacteria.
Cool. Well, if there's no more questions, I guess you could join me in all thanking Tyler for joining us today, and thanks for agreeing to show up half an hour later for this seminar. And yeah, and if people are here that are grad students and are interested in doing the biology graduate student science symposium here in April, Kelly just put a link into the chat and you can fill that out to gauge interest. So, and that goes for people at MI too, Tyler, if they're interested in presenting here. So cool.
Cool. Thank you. Thank you for the invitation.
Yeah. Thank you.
Cheers.